All right, let's continue making sense of what's being said and perhaps try to get a sense of what the way forward looks like. As you can see there, we're joined now by social justice activist Mark Heywood, who was also with Section 27 at the time of sounding the alarm about the treatment of psychiatric patients, especially by government institutions. Mark, it's lovely to see you. Thanks very much indeed for making time to speak to us. You know, before we jump into the findings and the implications thereof, the sense I'm getting the morning after is that, you know, some people were hoping for more of a sense of occasion from yesterday's judgment. You know, it doesn't help that it was virtual, but besides that, you know, the judge at some stage seems to have lost her part as she was reading out the judgment. And it almost felt, according to some people, that the families themselves didn't get the kind of, again, moment that perhaps they would have hoped for 8 years after this tragedy took place. And I wonder what your take on that is.
Good morning, Ayanda. I think you're right. I mean, it was such a momentous day yesterday. As Christine just explained in the clip that you played, families have fought and fought and fought and worked with the lawyers and kept on pursuing justice. It's literally almost 8 years to the day since the news of the death started to come through. That in some ways it was almost, it was a huge vindication, but there needed to be a place where people could mark that moment, and it wasn't there yesterday. But having said that, you know, it doesn't diminish the significance of the finding of this inquest, of direct responsibility by the MEC, Qedani, Mahlangu and Manamela, the Chief Director of Mental Health Care Services, of responsibility for those deaths. So, as you've said, you know, the big question now is what happens to make sure that justice really is served. You know, in these 8 years, we've gone through an investigation by Professor Makgabo, which found responsibility by these people. We've gone through the arbitration with Deputy Chief Justice Dehydration Moseneke, which found responsibility or pointed responsibility at Qedani, Mahlangu and others. And now we have this inquest. You know, we've had to go through three major hurdles, three major steps to just get to the point where they can be prosecuted. So I really pray now that the prosecution takes place swiftly and that it works with all of the evidence that has been accumulated in the processes that I have referred to. Absolutely.
In many ways, the ball is in the NPA's court, and something tells me they're aware of that, because yesterday afternoon they released their own statement saying that they've noted this particular finding from the courts, and I suppose are studying the report itself. It would be certainly a miscarriage of justice if there weren't to be any kind of movement. At least that's the sentiment from a lot of people who've been watching this, and I imagine a sentiment you share too.
Yes, there has to be. That's the purpose of law and criminal law. You know, we're talking about 144 very vulnerable people in the care of the state, in the care of the MEC for Health and her Department of Health, who suffered torture, who suffered indignity, who died, and quite a number who did not die but suffered terrible pain. Now the inquest has said that these two officials were responsible for those deaths, for 10 of those deaths. And the reason the judge pronounced on 10 of those deaths was because Section 27's lawyers decided that they would focus on those cases where the evidence was strongest, showing the causality between the actions of Qedani, Mahlangu and Manamela and the deaths of those patients. But basically what that judgment signals was responsibility for 144 deaths. That's a terrible thing. I mean, just imagine that. We're not talking one death. We're talking 144 vulnerable people whose deaths were preventable and unnecessary. The full weight of the criminal law must now pronounce on responsibility for that and on a sentence for that.
Yeah, absolutely. What shouldn't, of course, be lost to us, Mark, is that several other patients are still missing. I think upwards of about 40 or so. And I just shudder at the thought of what those families might be going through, even though, there's been a unanimous, if you like, kind of, proclamation from the different phases of the investigations that you've just outlined.
Yes, you're right. I mean, you can't quantify the pain. The only people who can quantify the pain were the people who were on the receiving end of it, and the families who had to go and find out what had happened to their loved ones and were confronted with lies, obfuscation, and eventually terrible horror stories. As you said, I've been close to this case. I was looking just yesterday through the evidence that was presented by Section 27 in the legal papers. It still makes you shiver to read what happened to these patients and the pain and the degradation that they were subjected to. And as you could see, just listening to Virginia, who is a person of incredible bravery and commitment to her family and her sister Virginia and the others, 8 years later, that pain is still raw. And we are a country with a constitution that promises people life, that promises people dignity, that promises people access to healthcare services. We must take those promises seriously. This must never, never, never happen again under any circumstances.
Yeah, and we'll speak about that in just a moment, but you make reference to that evidence, and you're absolutely right. There were starvations taking place, some of the patients being tied up as they were being transported to these NGOs. In some instances, some of them not being given their medication, or in fact being given the wrong medication, exacerbating their illness. The kind of stuff that came out of the different investigations have really put a blemish on this, and that's why it comes as no surprise that Life Esidimeni is still considered one of the greatest human rights violations of our democratic era.
And it is. It was a defining moment of failure, of state failure, of governmental failure, of the failure of the Department of Health. Our democracy has had certain great successes. We've achieved a lot in 30 years, but we've also had some terrible preventable tragedies. There was the failure of the response to the AIDS epidemic, which literally led to hundreds of thousands of people dying who wouldn't have died if they'd had access to medicines. There's been the Marikana tragedy, massacre. There's been Life Esidimeni. I think it stands alongside those others. There's been instances like the death of little Michael Kamapi, who fell to the bottom of his school pit toilet. Again, representing just sometimes how badly we treat poor people and vulnerable people. And that's what we have to learn from this. There has to be a commitment to the people who most need the rule of law, who most need protection, who most trust that the state will do what the state is there to do. And in the case of healthcare services, that means providing access to care, access to treatment, shelter, love, and something that we can trust, which was something that we failed on every score when we look at Life Esidimeni.
Absolutely. That inquest being very unequivocal that those deaths could have been prevented if only, for example, Dr. Manamela visited these NGOs and saw for himself that they weren't actually equipped to deal with these patients. You make mention of hopefully being able to prevent a repeat of what's taken place. And I wonder how confident you are about that, Mark. Have the systems changed in Gauteng Health? Is the procedure, for example, of taking care of psychiatric patients any different in order to ensure that, in fact, what happened and what is continuing to happen in the form of the blame game doesn't happen again?
Well, look, let me answer that question in two ways. First of all, I want to say that we have fantastic doctors working in mental health care in the public health sector in our hospitals. Some of them, like Dr. Talatala, who gave evidence and was involved in Life Esidimeni, today continuing work at big hospitals like Chris Hani Baragwanath. We have great doctors doing their very best. But what breaks my heart and others' heart about Life Esidimeni is that it hasn't actually led to an improvement in investment, in budgets for mental health care, in training of more healthcare workers to diagnose, to treat mental illnesses. You know, I think if you were to do a quick spot check of the state of mental health care facilities across the country, you would find quite a number of facilities where you would say people are living in conditions in which they should not be made to live, particularly given their vulnerabilities. You know, mental health has always been stigmatized, has always been denied, has always been, mental illness rather, has always been kind of hidden. But mental illness in our country is an epidemic now.
Yeah.
It has got worse since the COVID-19 epidemic. It is far more prevalent than people think. And it's a tiny number of people who are trying to provide the services and the care. I have to mention, for example, the role of the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, who were part of the original group that complained and drew attention to Life Esidimeni. You know, those people, it's an NGO on a daily basis. They take calls from people who are desperate, from people who need advice on mental illness, where to get care, how to get care, etc. We need to do with mental health what, you know, activists like the Treatment Action Campaign did with HIV, which is to make sure that it gets the resources, the political prioritization, the access to care and treatment that people are entitled to in terms of our constitution.
Absolutely. Well, Mark Heywood, hopefully justice is finally meted out, at the very least, to send a strong message to people who might think that circumventing the law pays off. Mark Heywood, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Mark is a social justice activist, also was with Section 27, organization that had been integral in seeing through the process to this point. Once again, thanks very much indeed.